viewers and listeners from all over the world. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Elomba Television tonight. Our topic discussion is a very important expose. The theme is Boko Haram, the inside story of Nigeria's first terrorist organization. Our guest tonight is Prince Charles Dickson, PhD. He's a team leader at Red Center, a local peace builder with Peace Direct, an investigative journalist, and an author of repute. Dr. Charles Dickson, you are welcome to the program.
A wonderful evening from this part of the world. It's nice to be sharing this platform with you, and it's a privilege. Thank you very much.
Yes, before we go on to this discussion, Prince, we would like to know, would you like to tell us about your investigation, how you come about to be interested in Boko Haram terrorism in Nigeria?
I did like to say my connection with Boko Haram as a subject matter comes from two sides of the divide. One as a subject matter of interest as an academic topic. On the other side, pretty much as a inter-religious, interfaith dialogue expert and the evolution of Boko Haram itself and what we know of the beginnings of Boko Haram. Did I know that years after what I would call a chance meeting would develop into me having to concentrate on the subject matter all this while? No, I didn't know that. But more than a decade and still counting, it's something that when we look back, we can only shake our head. Sadly, Boko Haram, like most things Nigeria and Nigerian, has also developed its complexity in terms of local context. And I think that's one of the things that has kept me as a person and a lot of us on the subject matter for this long.
All right. Would you want to tell us about a Ford Foundation sponsorship, if I may call it that you took part in? Is this something you would like to talk about?
Well, I think basically the Ford Foundation Reportage Fellowship was a coincidence. At that point, we were at the heat of Boko Haram, as it were. The Chibok incident had just taken place, and the controversy regarding whether it did happen and all that was at the center of public discourse. I had the opportunity to be in conversation with a couple of colleagues, and that opportunity came. And when we thought about all that we could do and what was worth our time, what the money and was of public good, Boko Haram came up as one of the topics we wanted to, of course, move into. Another good part or another coincidence for us as a group of journalists was that the funding was available and a few of us had already started prior work on Boko Haram as an insurgent group.
All right. Will you also tell us about Tri-Center? What is it about?
Well, Tri-Center is short for the Tatanawa Roundtable Initiative. Tri-Center is basically from the word Tatanawa, which means let's reason together. Interestingly, that word depicts where Nigeria is as a country, the need for conversation, the need for a dialogue, the need for negotiation regarding how we want to be as a people, the need for a structure to call ours. I often would say I'm not necessarily an advocate of restructuring because what we currently have is not a structure. You first have a structure and then you can talk about restructuring the structure. So I often, I would rather say, it's important that we negotiate, and Tautana is all about negotiating reasonably among stakeholders in the conflict spectrum.
And what about Peace Direct? What is it about?
Peace Direct is London-based donor charity that works within also the peace building spectrum, which is my domain, apart from the media. And what we do is to basically help locally based organization within also the thematic peace area.
Now, when you and your colleagues got this funding to investigate some of these activities, which eventually included Boko Haram, what did you actually do? What does those investigations involve?
Let me start from a very light note. What I first of all did was to pray I survive it, because then very little was known, and I think it had begun to get wings. It had started growing. Uh, we saw the localization of it. We were very limited in terms of what to look at, what to expect. Of course, maybe when I start to look into the story, the beginnings of Boko Haram itself, it paints a big picture of where we were moving into. It was more like moving into the dark, whether as media personnel, whether in our civil military relations, whether in terms of relationship with host community where Boko Haram was initially domiciled, whether in early conversations with the late Yusuf, or with a colleague like Ahmed Salkida, who we were together in leadership at some point, or my now late colleague in the NTA, who was one of the journalists who died in those, who was actually killed in those early days of Boko Haram.
Yeah, so now you just mentioned Yusuf. What we simply know is that Yusuf was the founder of Boko Haram. Is there more you can tell us about that man?
Well, let me look at the timeline, as it were. As a group, as an insurgent group, Boko Haram started to feature in literature, in our subconscious, amongst people in that northeast area between 2000, 2001, 2002. Of course, the earliest you can find conversations was when there was a disagreement somewhere in Kanama, Goza villages around the Yobe Borno axis. That was the first time they became pretty much public, and a few of us had heard about it. But beyond the narrative of Yusuf as leader of Boko Haram, Boko Haram as not exactly Boko Haram, but as fruit or seed sown, could go back into the 70s, early 70s, into the 80s, thereabouts. It used to be part of what we'll call in Islam schisms, which for those Hausa-speaking audience we have, we used to call them the Tashayowa, under the leadership of Sheikh Ibrahim El Zaki. And it was basically what we look back and call preacher against warrior, warlord in terms of Islamic evangelism. What they did at that point was to attract a new radicalized Muslim young people who were emotional, who were looking, of course, lost, and were looking for what I would pretty much regard as a messiah as at that time. And one of those young persons happened to be Mohammed Yusuf.
I'm afraid that this discussion will be leading me astray from my planned question, because when you say something, I now want to pinpoint it and get to the root of it. In answering question about Yusuf, you also mentioned El Zaki. What is the relationship between Yusuf and El Zaki?
Of course, El Zaki was, for lack of a better word, I use the word mentor, but he was the leader of a budding radical young Muslim faithful as at that point. And interestingly, amongst his many followers was Mohammed Yusuf.
Okay, so when Yusuf started his movement, he started like a preacher. And there is nothing about killing or terrorism involved, isn't it?
Yeah, permit me to remove the word like. He basically was your run-of-the-mill preacher. That was basically, yes, the rhetorics with time became as harsh as they could be, but he just came up as your everyday Islamic preacher.
And so at one time, at what point then did he turn to violent activism?
Well, let me not use the word violent activism at this stage of a historical ride into Boko Haram. Of course, most people, just for our audience, when you look at Islam, and I try so hard not to shift or digress. Sects are commonplace. There's always that breakup. There's always that faction. There's always a disagreement fundamentally across one aspect of Islam or the other in terms. And it's commonplace to see that one brotherhood breaks up for any kind of reason. It might be it might be associated to gender worship. It might be associated. I mean, let me give you a practical example of recent in the sighting of the moon, where a particular sect decides to, whether the moon does come or not, left for another conversation, decides to break its Ramadan on a particular day, while the other sects insist on running the 30-day period. So it wasn't basically more of when did it actually become violent. So what happened was, why a lot of people remained loyal to Zaki. We now had the Salafiyah, the Jamaatul Tawhid Islama, who also was like break up from the brotherhood. So sometime around 90, 98, 99, I wouldn't be too sure of those dates, but around one of those years, either 98, 99, a certain Abu Bakr established the Sunnah Wal Shabab group, which was more like a Muslim youth organization. I had reason to be with him. That organization was stationed in Borno in the 90s. And under the leadership of Abu Bakr, the group was not associated with violence. Okay. But when Yusuf took over as leader of that group, because he went with that faction, you would notice that the violent streak gradually started entering into the conversation. Now, there's this school of thought that believe that Mohammed Yusuf probably was as a result of Stobia, where he had become aligned with the Al-Sunnah group, which loosely are the people committed to the removal of innovations and what we call contemporary Islam. They were stuck on the conservatism of Islam. So I think, and rightly so, having spoken to him shortly before his death, that was where radicalization had set in.
So let's just confirm this point, that you actually met with Mohammed Yusuf, leader of Boko Haram.
Yes.
And what is the nature of that meeting?
Purely professional, investigative media professional.
And what did he tell you?
Conversations centered basically on what had now at that point become very political, relationships between himself and the government of Borno State as at that time.
Now, what is the relationship between Mohammed Yusuf and the government of Borno State at that point in time?
Well, again, that also probably takes us into again, the relationship between religion, statism, and politics in this part of the country and this part of the world itself. Of course, our democracy, well, tongue in check for a school of thoughts, seems to still say it is budding, it is growing. Another seems to ask how long would it grow. But as at that point, several of Mohammed Yusuf's followers had political underpinnings. And because so seen as loosely a simple who had gained so much popularity, it was not uncommon to notice that there were members of the political class who were part of his sect. There were members of the security forces who were part of his sect. So many people across the board had pledged allegiance to his own group under, if I recall, the leadership of Alhaji Muhammad Indimi Mox in Maiduguri as at that time.
Okay, let's move down to what led to his death. Why was he killed, and under what circumstances was Mohammed Yusuf killed?
Sadly, should Mohammed Yusuf should he have been killed? I dare say no. And I don't know how this sits, but this is me talking from a very purely professional point of view. The killing of Mohammed Yusuf escalated the entire scenario, brought us to where we are. And because at that point, I think if we had handled all the branches of what Boko Haram was at the initial stage, it would have been able as a nation state to have navigated outside the Mohammed Yusuf quagmire. Killing Mohammed Yusuf when he was killed brought us to where we are, because it's not just that he was killed. Let's establish the fact that he was extrajudicially murdered. He was killed while in police custody, and as is with the case, whatever variants of you take the wrong step, there's always that room for escalation.
So let's also establish this point. What made Mohammed Yusuf's Boko Haram to transmute into violence, since they were simply religious preachers in the beginning?
There were several reasons. Let me take one step back and then I'll come back. Sometime in 2001, 2001, in Kanama village, the group split. There was a splinter group. And what led to that split was basically a dispute over fishing rights. That was all that led to armed conflict in a splinter of the group, which led the police to come in to settle the disputes. In what transpired afterwards, where a few members ran to the police and they disarmed the police, set the police station on fire, a precedent had been set. So, as is with the tradition, don't let's forget that we had just navigated around places like Zaki, Biam, OD, where the government response was always to dispatch the army, raise down the community. That was the mosque in which several members of the group were killed, including, if I remember clearly, a factional head of the Boko Haram, Muhammad Ali, who was also killed. Surviving members of that group moved further and stayed in Maiduguri, where they met up with their old friends, old buddies, and of course, Mohammed Yusuf, who was now the sheikh or the missioner of the leader of the mosques in Ndimi, or the Ndimi. The group really was exposed to that public light, and of course, violence had become that strict they would use. And if I remember, I can't remember which of the, I think it was Punch or So that used the term the Nigerian Taliban. So that violence was born at that point. They would come in riding with motorcycles, go to a public police station and burn it down. They had established, that had started. So it was about that period.
And in the beginning, he had a very good relationship with the then governor of Borno State. What was his name again?
SAS.
I think
SAS used to be referred to Sheriff.
Sheriff, yes, Sheriff. And now they've turned to violence. So what exactly is their guiding philosophy? Let's remind ourselves. What is the guiding philosophy of the Boko Haram movement?
Well, there is, and this is tongue in check. Is there a guiding philosophy? Not exactly. Because when you say guiding philosophy, I mean, you make it sound a little bit nice. What has happened to Boko Haram, on the contrary, is a metamorphosis from a local insurgent group to what has now become a highly sophisticated force that we see what the result is between them and state forces. So a great deal has happened, from localization to their commitments, their strengths, which they've shown over and over. So we've seen an evolution rather than a philosophy, from when Boko Haram was about the bomb, the suicide bomb, to when they adopted local Taliban tactics of kidnapping, to when state facilities and state actors were targeted. So they basically evolved rather than have a strict philosophy. So we've moved from where they have had a synergy with other sources, you know, to where they've evolved to who they are, and then to where they've also split into other forces, onto other interests. And
Yes, we will, Dr. Prince, we will move into that in a moment.
Yeah.
At this point, when Yusuf died, who succeeded him?
Of course, has died again, succeeded him.
Sorry, who? We
Shekau.
didn't get that. There was problem with the network. Yeah, what?
Okay, can you
Yes,
hear
when
me
Mohammed
now?
Yusuf died, who succeeded him?
I said the man with many lives, the one we've come to recognize as Shekau, succeeded Mohammed Yusuf.
Is Shekau a title or just one individual?
Well, Shekau is not a title, essentially. I like to use the word Shekau is a brand. It's become a brand. It's evolved to a brand. So you have several Shekaus.
Because I know you know, I'm sure you understand why I'm asking, because Shekau have died several times and resurrected several times.
I'm sure you want to ask me if he's finally dead.
Okay.
He is dead.
And now we have an announcement that he died, I think 2 days ago. So is he finally dead?
He is dead. Let me take your mind back to the Shekau that died some 4 years ago. The first Shekau that died before the one of 4 years ago. If you recall, that Shekau was gladly pictured as against the living Shekau with the marks on the forehead and all that, before another Shekau died about 4 years ago. Yes, Shekau is dead.
Shekau is dead. Now, did you meet with this Shekau? Did you meet him?
Would I tell you yes? No.
Okay, did anybody actually meet? Because you met the original founders of Boko Haram. So these other very, very violent leaders, did you meet any of them?
I might not be privileged to answer that question. Let me say this way. Let me put it this way, right? Alumba, between 2000 and 2003, and that was under the leadership of Mala Kachala, who was a very good friend, right? 90% of the membership of Boko Haram was drawn across state politics. When I mean state politics, there were commissioners who were members of Boko Haram. I recall that Mohammed Yusuf himself was building a mosque, a masjid, in a land that was donated by his father-in-law. I remember Fuga, who donated to the group, and it enjoyed support from Malat Kachala. And it's important to have a merger of thoughts. That was also at the beginning of the Sharia controversy. And Borno State was also at the heat of that conversation. So there was support. There was official public policy. It was state policy to support the likes of Mohammed Yusuf until Sharif now won the election. I think with Sharif came what we will refer to as a significant growth of the group as a group, as an Islamic group, moving from Borno to Yobe and Bauchi and Gombe and pretty much every other place, and until that altercation had happened. So if you look at that properly, you would begin to now understand that it was the case of us not understanding the enemy within.
Yes, someone posted a note, because I will be taking up when people either want to ask a question or post a note. Let's clarify this point. Although I'm sure I understand what you mean, but maybe let our listeners also understand. A post here says, Shekau is the name of his place of birth. His real name is Abu Muhammad Abubakar bin Muhammad. So it's not a title. Would you want to comment? Or
no, it's not a no. Yes. Like I said, it's not a title. It's a brand. It's traditionally what we do in this part of the climb, where names are part of either a locality or either what or either what your father does. Shekau is not his name.
Yes. Okay. So there was a relationship between Boko Haram members and the ruling elite of Borno State at that time.
That's correct.
And a lot of people in government were also members of Boko Haram at that point.
Yes. What had happened at that point was, under the leadership of Sheriff, what Boko Haram had gradually metamorphosed into was a state within a state. They had become a government by themselves. They had gradually started establishing administrative institutional structures. They had their own. I remember Mohammed Yusuf had taken me to a large farm, which they were running themselves. They had their own police. They had some form of system within the same system. They were providing they were running a kind of communist system, as it were. They were providing both social and economic relief. And this was also helping them draw membership.
So when Mohammed Yusuf was kind of having a conversation with you, taking you around, talking to you about Boko Haram, what impression did you get about Boko Haram at that time?
It's still the impression you get when you have conversations centered around this. A conversation of a failed system, a failed state. The truth of the matter was that what Boko Haram had done at that point was to exploit the system. A system full of poverty. It was a system full of warmth. There were influx of refugees from village Chad. So it was what it was. Boko Haram was a function of a failed system. If governance was available, then we wouldn't have needed a Boko Haram or a Mohammed Yusuf, as it were, from the onset.
All right. So at that time, you had what we call, let me say, you have a good relationship. Not that you had a working relationship. Let me say you had a working relationship with them, where you will meet them, chat about their goals, what they do, and then do your investigative reporting.
Let me answer that question in a very rather naive manner, and then we can relate it. In recent times, you've come across where kidnappers have said they were brought in by the political elites, and this was not part of the agreement, and this is where they find themselves in. So let's put that in perspective. At that point, they had been allowed to fester. They had been allowed to become institutionalized. They had become what they became. But originally, that wasn't what they were meant to be. So let me put up another dynamic into the conversation. Imagine a redeemed Christian Church of God with its membership and leadership metamorphosing, for whatever wrong reasons, into an insurgent group or a terrorist group.
Okay, someone posted something here that made me want to ask this question. When Boko Haram was preaching about his Sharia, his own version of Islam, was it his intention to eventually branch out of Borno State and spread his Islamic fundamentalism to other parts of Nigeria, or simply to remain within Borno State?
I'll answer that question in one phrase. Understanding the religious landscape in northern Nigeria, understanding what happened in 2001 to 2004, which we call the failure of the Kananam commune, as it were. We refer to it as the failure of jihad. And then you need to understand the involvement of the Salafi community. And then, I wish I didn't have to say this, but please, my audience, take it in the light in which it was said. We also saw the evolution of the Pantamis, what we refer to as from preachers to preacher warriors. So yes, there was a bigger picture, and the bigger picture was Islamization based on that understanding. So there was extensive dawah, what we call preaching, and not just the dawah. There were debates across clerics, different schools of thoughts. debates across Western education, Western civilization, secularism, corruption within the states. And in the course of this conversation, for Boko Haram, the ideal was that we were going to have an Islamic state, by and large.
By any means necessary?
Yes, by any means necessary.
Now, what is the composition of these original Boko Haram members? Is it the importance of this question will be what a comment in the chat room now said about the caliphate. They wanted to declare a caliphate. What's the relationship between, even without Boko Haram, but what is the relationship between the Kanuri and the caliphate based in Sokoto State? Let's establish this fundamental before we proceed. What do you think?
Well, sometimes, let me quickly correct an impression. For Nigerians, it's very strong to use that word, what do we think? But sadly, and truthfully, as the case might be, from the academic standpoint and from what it is, it's not what we think, it is what it is. There are two schools of thought. Underneath those two schools, there are various other dichotomies. So first of all, Islam as practice has its Puritan angle, and then it has what we would probably want to refer to as contemporary Islam. Now, let me say this pretty much clear. Boko Haram, as a sect, had conducted its operations more or less peacefully for the first 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. That drastically changed in 2009, 2010, when an investigation had been launched into the group activities following reports that the members had started arming themselves. Chadians were coming in. A part of the sect in the Cameroon had also come in. Before that, Boko Haram was satisfied, and I put that in inverted commas, to stay within its confines of operation, which is why you cannot necessarily have that conversation of Boko Haram without asking questions, where does the Fulani ethnic group situate in the Boko Haram conversation? These are dynamics on their own that are totally different, okay? Now, the government of the day at that point had been increasingly inundated by even some of us. I remember on one such trip when I had come back, I had done an anonymous report and had sent it to those who should know that there's an increasing military character of this organization, including the fact that some military officers, as at that point, had become sympathetic to the cause. Now, be that as it may be, we cannot have a conversation of the caliphate without bringing in the emotions of Nigerians. Sadly, those who should know, those who are purportedly very educated, that live under this cocoon of there is an Islamic agenda. And when the Sultanate is mentioned, you cannot but have that conversation of Islamization. But you see, we sometimes put it in academic slates and say the opposite of an Islamic agenda would be a Christian agenda, would be salvation. So dare me ask, what is the Christian agenda?
Okay, now let's move into the Boko Haram mutation. How many factions of Boko Haram do you think we have today?
I've got 10 fingers. We've got as much as that. It's now metamorphosed into not just Boko Haram, but different. What we probably have now are warlords holding portions of territory and a chain command where it's about interest.
And what is the relationship between Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda?
It's
la 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 la